Great since you left me. It was about an hour ago, wasn't it?
It was probably about that.
Burt Reynolds had everything most people only dream of: fame, fortune, power. And beside him stood Loni Anderson, a superstar in her own right, admired, glamorous, and at the height of television fame. Together, they looked like an unstoppable duo. But behind the perfect image were heartbreaking cracks, financial chaos, physical pain, addiction, and a fall from grace that would end in a divorce that shattered them both. Nothing could have prepared the world for the tragic way their marriage and their life would eventually end. The rise of Burt Reynolds. From the outside, Burt Reynolds looked like a man who had won at life. He had fame that spanned decades, money that came fast and loud, and a public image built on confidence, humor, and effortless charm. By the late 1970s, he wasn't just successful. He was everywhere. Movies, magazine covers, television, and talk shows. His career looked bulletproof. His personal life, especially his marriage, was sold to the public as equally flawless. But that polished image hid years of physical pain, private disappointment, and decisions that slowly unraveled everything he built. And long before the tragic ending, the cracks were already there. Burt Reynolds was born Burton Leon Reynolds Jr. on February 11, 1936, in Lansing, Michigan. When Burt was about 10 years old, the family moved to Riviera Beach, Florida, a change that shaped him deeply. Florida gave him sunshine, open space, and most importantly, football. At Palm Beach High School, Burt stood out quickly. He was strong, fast, and competitive, and football became his entire identity. That talent earned him a scholarship to Florida State University, where he played halfback for the Seminoles. At that point, acting wasn't even on his radar. His future, as he saw it, was professional football. But in 1954, everything collapsed. A serious knee injury ended his football career almost overnight. Not long after, a car accident made the injury worse. The damage was permanent. His scholarship was gone, and with it, the life he had planned since he was a teenager. Suddenly, Burt Reynolds was a young man with no direction, constant pain, and no backup plan. He worked odd jobs to survive, waiting tables, doing construction, and taking whatever work he could find. It was during this period that a single college class quietly changed his future. At Palm Beach Junior College, Burt enrolled in an English class taught by Professor Watson B. Duncan III. Duncan noticed something unusual in him. He encouraged Burt to try acting, something no one had ever suggested to him before. Burt took the advice seriously. He landed a small role in a college production of Outward Bound. To his surprise, he didn't just enjoy it, he was good at it. That performance led him to win the Florida State Drama Award, which opened the door to further training at the Hyde Park Playhouse in New York. For the first time since his injury, Burt had a new sense of purpose. In the late 1950s, he began working on stage, appearing in productions like Tea and Sympathy and Mr. Roberts. The work was steady, but far from glamorous. He wasn't famous, and money was tight, but he was learning discipline, timing, and how to command an audience. Those years shaped his instincts as a performer more than any later success ever would. Television followed soon after. Burt landed small roles in series like Flight and Riverboat between 1959 and 1960. Then came the role that changed everything, Quint Asper, the blacksmith on Gunsmoke. From 1962 to 1965, Burt became a familiar face in American living rooms. He wasn't the lead, but viewers noticed him. He had a rugged look, a relaxed confidence, and a presence that felt natural rather than forced. The 1970s turned Burt Reynolds into a phenomenon. Between 1978 and 1982, he became the highest-grossing actor in the world for 5 consecutive years. His films dominated the box office, and his good old boy charm made him a cultural symbol of the era. He leaned into humor, self-awareness, and physical comedy in a way few leading men dared to. His career later earned serious recognition. He won a Golden Globe and received an Academy Award nomination for Boogie Nights. He won an Emmy Award for Evening Shade. And in a moment that perfectly captured his confidence, he posed for a now-famous Cosmopolitan nude centerfold, a move that shocked some and solidified his larger-than-life persona. But while the public saw success and swagger, Burt Reynolds was already carrying years of pain, physical injuries, financial pressure, and personal choices that would soon catch up to him. And as his fame peaked, his private life was quietly moving toward a collision no one saw coming. At the center of it all was a relationship celebrated in public, strained in private, and destined to leave lasting scars on both him and the woman involved. The connection with Loni Anderson. When Burt Reynolds and Loni Anderson crossed paths in the early 1980s, they were both firmly established stars. Burt was still carrying the weight of his box office dominance from the previous decade, one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. Loni, meanwhile, had become a household name as the glamorous, sharp-witted star of WKRP in Cincinnati. Each represented success in their own lane, and together, they looked like a perfect match. They began dating in 1982, and the reaction was immediate. The tabloids latched on almost overnight with photographs, headlines, and speculation. Their relationship became public property almost as soon as it began. In an era obsessed with celebrity couples, they were quickly placed in the same category as Hollywood's biggest power pairings. Wherever they went, cameras followed. From the outside, the pairing made complete sense. Burt embodied rugged masculinity mixed with humor, while Loni projected elegance, confidence, and star power. Together, they looked balanced. Interviews from the time often framed them as equals, two successful people who understood the pressures of fame and chose each other anyway. It made the relationship feel grown-up, stable, and intentional. On April 29, 1988, Burt Reynolds and Loni Anderson were married in a lavish ceremony attended by Hollywood elites. The wedding was widely covered in entertainment media, with photographs and glowing descriptions filling magazines and television segments. The message was clear. This was a storybook romance. Two stars, later in life, finally settling down. For a public accustomed to watching Burt Reynolds as a bachelor figure, the marriage suggested stability. For Loni Anderson, it reinforced her position not just as a television icon, but as part of Hollywood's inner circle. Shortly after their marriage, they adopted a son, Quentin Anderson Reynolds. The adoption was a sign that this was a serious, lasting commitment. Anderson already had a daughter, Deidre Hoffman, from a previous marriage, but Quentin was her only child with Reynolds. In the early years, the marriage appeared affectionate and unified. Burt and Loni were frequently photographed together at award shows, premieres, and charity events. They smiled easily in public, held hands, and spoke warmly about each other in interviews. Burt often praised Loni's beauty and charisma, presenting her as both a loving partner and a grounding force in his life. Loni, in turn, spoke of his charm and humor, highlighting the side of him audiences already loved. Their public appearances followed a pattern: coordinated outfits, relaxed body language, and a sense of mutual pride. Nothing about their presentation suggested tension or imbalance. If anything, they looked carefully aligned, aware of the spotlight, but comfortable within it. But the same spotlight that made their relationship look flawless also magnified every flaw. What looked like a perfect Hollywood union was quietly becoming fragile. And long before the public knew it, the marriage that once symbolized happiness and success was already carrying the weight of unresolved strain, setting the stage for an unraveling that would shock fans and change both of their lives forever. The divorce that shocked the world. When Burt Reynolds and Loni Anderson's marriage began to unravel, it was one of the most explosive and publicly dissected divorces Hollywood had seen in years. It did so in full view of the public, with accusations, lawsuits, and headlines that refused to fade. The first cracks appeared around money. Despite Burt Reynolds' reputation as one of the highest-paid actors of his era, reports began circulating that finances inside the marriage were far from stable. Stories surfaced of maxed-out credit cards and reckless spending, painting a picture that clashed sharply with the image of endless wealth. Reynolds' long-standing habit of lavish purchases, expensive homes, luxury items, and impulsive financial decisions became a point of tension. Anderson, according to reports at the time, wanted more stability and structure. That difference alone created friction that never fully eased. Money wasn't the only problem. Their lifestyles began pulling in opposite directions. Reynolds was used to living fast, spending freely, and trusting that another hit film would always be around the corner. Anderson, juggling her own career and motherhood, reportedly worried about long-term security. Those opposing approaches turned daily decisions into ongoing arguments, and over time, the tone of the marriage reportedly darkened. Behind closed doors, the relationship grew volatile. Descriptions of the marriage later surfaced using words like toxic, with claims of emotional maltreatment and frequent explosive arguments. What made matters worse was that none of it stayed private. Tabloids fed relentlessly on every rumor, fight, financial dispute, and growing distance, turning personal conflict into public spectacle. The pressure intensified with every headline. But the marriage reached its breaking point when accusations of infidelity surfaced. Burt Reynolds publicly admitted that he had been unfaithful during the marriage. That admission shifted the narrative dramatically. Loni Anderson accused him of betrayal, cruelty, and emotional maltreatment, reinforcing the idea that the relationship had been deeply unstable. Reports also suggested substance abuse played a role in worsening the volatility, though neither side ever presented a single unified version of events. Reynolds did not stay silent. He fired back with his own claims, accusing Anderson of being a bad mother and asserting that she had married him for his money. The dispute quickly became less about reconciliation and more about control of the narrative, of finances, and of their future. In 1993, Reynolds formally filed for divorce. By the time it was finalized in 1994, the damage was extensive. What might have been a private separation turned into a courtroom battle that dominated entertainment news. At the center of it all was their adopted son, Quentin Anderson Reynolds. Custody became fiercely contested, with both sides making serious claims about the other's fitness as a parent. The financial fallout was staggering. The divorce was widely described as one of Hollywood's most expensive, leaving Reynolds millions of dollars in debt. Legal fees, settlements, and long-standing spending habits combined into a financial collapse that shocked even those familiar with his past earnings. Anderson later accused Reynolds of failing to pay agreed-upon support. Reynolds responded by claiming Anderson was manipulative and driven by money. The back-and-forth dragged on for years. As emotions hardened, so did the language. Reynolds told reporters that Anderson was the worst mistake of his life. Anderson, in return, described him as emotionally manipulative and unreliable, offering a picture of a marriage filled with fear and instability. Lost in the noise was their son. Quentin largely stayed out of the spotlight as he grew older, later choosing to work behind the scenes in Hollywood rather than in front of the camera. While his parents' names remained tied to controversy, he avoided public commentary altogether. What began as a celebrated Hollywood romance ended as one of the most infamous celebrity divorces of its time. For many, the marriage came to overshadow parts of both careers, redefining how they were discussed in the years that followed. And yet, the divorce was not the end of the problems. It was only the beginning of a much quieter, more painful chapter. The aftermath of the split. When the divorce ended on paper, its consequences were only beginning in real life, especially for Loni Anderson. The years that followed were quieter, harder, and far less forgiving than the public ever realized. Fame did not protect her. In many ways, it complicated everything. Professionally, Anderson entered a prolonged career slowdown after the early 1990s. Once one of television's most recognizable faces, she found that the momentum she had built during her WKRP and Cincinnati years no longer carried the same weight. casting opportunities became sporadic. The industry still saw her clearly, but too narrowly. She struggled to escape the glamorous Jennifer Marlowe image that had made her famous, an image that now worked against her rather than for her. She continued acting, but the roles were smaller and less visible. She appeared in television movies, including the 1985 remake of A Letter to Three Wives and projects like Partners in Crime. Guest roles followed on popular shows such as Sabrina the Teenage Witch and Melrose Place. These appearances kept her working, but they didn't restore her former status. The steady climb she once enjoyed flattened into a long plateau. Behind the scenes, her finances remained a constant source of stress. The divorce fallout dragged on well after the final decree. Anderson accused Burt Reynolds of failing to meet agreed financial support obligations, leading to years of disputes that kept the wounds open. Legal battles were expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Raising their adopted son, Quentin, largely on her own, added another layer of pressure. Parenthood came with costs, financial, emotional, and logistical, at a time when her career income was no longer predictable. While she avoided putting her son in the spotlight, the responsibility of providing stability in the midst of public chaos weighed heavily. Public perception only made things worse. Tabloids frequently framed Anderson as greedy or materialistic, often repeating Reynolds' accusations without balance. The labels stuck. In an industry where reputation quietly shapes opportunity, that narrative hurt. She wasn't just dealing with career stagnation. She was fighting an image that followed her into casting rooms and social circles. The humiliation was public and lasting. Reynolds' harsh comments lingered in headlines long after the marriage ended, and Anderson found herself stigmatized in ways that were difficult to reverse. Hollywood, famously unforgiving, moved on quickly, but not always kindly. Emotionally, the years after the split were isolating. Anderson later admitted in interviews that the scale of the scandal made it hard to trust people. Friendships blurred into suspicion. New relationships felt risky. Balancing personal disappointment with single motherhood required constant emotional discipline. However, she soon began rebuilding. Part of that rebuilding meant reshaping how she was seen. She spent years distancing herself from the tabloid narrative, choosing fewer interviews and more controlled public appearances. She wanted to be known again for her work, not her divorce. That gradual shift became clearer in the 2000s. In 2008, Anderson married Bob Flick, a founding member of the folk band The Brothers Four. The marriage stood in stark contrast to her previous one. It was private, low-key, and largely absent from tabloids. There were no spectacular headlines, no public battles. Stability, rather than glamour, defined this chapter of her life. Family became her center. She devoted herself to her children, her daughter, Deidre Hoffman, from her first marriage, and her son, Quentin. That choice, while quieter, brought a sense of control she had long lacked. Anderson also turned toward advocacy. Inspired by her parents' struggles with respiratory illness, she became involved in causes related to lung health and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease awareness. These efforts were personal rather than performative. They gave her purpose outside the entertainment cycle and allowed her to connect with audiences in a way that had nothing to do with scandal. Her public appearances became selective. She showed up at charity events and nostalgia conventions, often celebrating her WKRP legacy with fans who had never abandoned her. By the late 2000s, she was seen less as a tabloid figure and more as a veteran actress, someone whose career had endured turbulence but not erasure. The rebuild was slow, but it worked. The noise faded, and the labels softened. What remained was a woman who had survived one of Hollywood's most brutal public divorces and quietly reclaimed her footing. Meanwhile, across the same years, the man once defined by box office dominance was heading in the opposite direction. And while Anderson found stability away from the spotlight, Burt Reynolds' post-divorce path would lead into a far steeper and more troubling decline that would ultimately redefine the final chapter of his life. The tragic decline of Burt Reynolds. By the mid-1980s, the momentum that once defined Burt Reynolds' career had begun to slow, and the reasons were far deeper than changing tastes or box office trends. His decline was physical, financial, and emotional, each feeding into the other until the weight became impossible to ignore. At the center of it all was pain. Burt Reynolds lived with chronic pain for decades, the result of a career built on physicality and risk. Unlike many stars of his era, he often performed his own stunts. Films like Deliverance and Smokey and The Bandit demanded endurance, falls, impacts, and strain that accumulated over time. He suffered lasting injuries to his back, jaw, and shoulders, requiring multiple surgeries over the years. Recovery was never complete. Pain became a daily condition rather than a temporary setback. To manage it, Reynolds turned to prescription medication, a decision that gradually turned into dependency. He later admitted to struggling with addiction, acknowledging that what began as a medical necessity spiraled into something harder to control. The addiction clouded his judgment, affected relationships, and complicated his ability to work consistently. At the same time, his finances were unraveling. Reynolds had lived large during his peak years. Mansions, luxury cars, and expensive hobbies were part of his identity. He invested heavily in ventures that never paid off: restaurants, a dinner theater, and risky real estate deals. When the income slowed, the expenses didn't. By 1996, the situation collapsed publicly. Burt Reynolds filed for bankruptcy, reporting debts that exceeded $10 million. For a man once labeled the highest-grossing actor in the world, the fall was staggering. To cover debts, he was forced to sell his Florida mansion, prized memorabilia, and personal possessions accumulated over a lifetime. Items that symbolized success quietly disappeared, one by one. His career decline made recovery even harder. The box office hits that once guaranteed financial stability were replaced by flops throughout the late 1980s and 90s. Offers became less frequent, and when they came, they often repeated the same narrow, macho, comedic image. That typecasting limited his access to more serious dramatic roles at a time when he wanted them most. Looking back, Reynolds openly regretted turning down major opportunities. He reportedly passed on roles in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Star Wars, and Terms of Endearment, decisions he later described as mistakes that haunted him. Each what if added to the sense that his career had slipped through his hands, not all at once, but choice by choice. In 1997, a comeback finally arrived. His performance in Boogie Nights earned widespread critical acclaim and an Academy Award nomination, reminding audiences of his depth and range. But even that moment was complicated. Reynolds clashed with director Paul Thomas Anderson, publicly distancing himself from the film despite its success. What should have been a clean redemption became another missed opportunity to rebuild bridges in Hollywood. Behind the scenes, his mental health took a hit. The combination of physical pain, financial collapse, public humiliation, and fading status took a toll. Reynolds spoke candidly in later years about feeling isolated and betrayed by an industry he once dominated. The tabloid coverage of his divorce and bankruptcy magnified the shame, turning private struggles into public entertainment. He battled depression and acknowledged experiencing dark thoughts during this period. What pulled him through was his son, Quentin Anderson Reynolds, and a small circle of close friends. Fatherhood became his anchor. Despite custody battles and personal turmoil, Reynolds consistently described Quentin as his greatest achievement, the one part of his life he would not trade or regret. Romantically, the stability never returned. He had high-profile relationships with Dinah Shore, Sally Field, and Loni Anderson, but none lasted. His breakup with Sally Field cut especially deep. Years later, he called her the love of his life, openly admitting that losing her was one of his biggest regrets. And as his health weakened and his world grew smaller, the final chapter of his life approached quietly. The noise faded, the crowds thinned. What remained were memories, regrets, and a legacy shaped as much by loss as by success. The final years of Burt Reynolds. By the early 2000s, Burt Reynolds' body was no longer keeping pace with his reputation. Public appearances revealed a man visibly thinner and increasingly frail. The confident physical presence that once defined his screen persona had faded, replaced by noticeable weight loss that sparked concern among fans and colleagues alike. Years of injuries, surgeries, and chronic pain had taken their toll, and his health struggles were no longer something he could keep private. Heart problems became a defining issue in his later years. In 2010, Reynolds underwent quintuple bypass surgery, a major procedure that underscored just how serious his condition had become. While he recovered enough to continue working and making appearances, he was never fully the same. His stamina declined, and travel became more difficult. Even so, he continued accepting select roles and attending events when he could, determined not to disappear quietly. By 2018, his condition had worsened significantly. He appeared increasingly fragile and was forced to cancel several scheduled appearances due to illness. Hollywood, long accustomed to his resilience, began to brace for the inevitable. On September 6, 2018, Burt Reynolds died at Jupiter Medical Center in Florida. He was 82 years old. The cause was cardiac arrest. While his death shocked Hollywood, it was also met with a quiet recognition that he had been battling serious health issues for years. Tributes poured in from actors, directors, and fans who had grown up watching his films and following his career. In the days that followed, attention returned to the complicated relationships that had shaped him, especially his marriage to Loni Anderson. Despite their bitter divorce in 1994, Anderson revealed in a 2019 interview that they had made peace before his death. After decades of public conflict, they found a measure of closure away from the headlines. She acknowledged the turbulence of their past without denying it, but emphasized that time had softened the edges. Reynolds himself had admitted in interviews that Anderson stood by him during some of his darkest health struggles, even though their marriage ultimately did not survive. Their son, Quentin Anderson Reynolds, remained characteristically private throughout this period. Reports indicated that he was close to his father until the end, offering quiet support without engaging in public commentary. Reynolds was cremated shortly after his death. For more than 2 years, his ashes remained with family before their final resting place was decided. In February 2021, his ashes were interred at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, a fitting location for a man whose life had been so deeply tied to the film industry. The ceremony was private, attended only by close friends and family. His gravesite is marked with a temporary headstone, with a commissioned bust planned to honor his legacy. And while his story closed with stillness rather than applause, the echoes of it would continue, especially in the life of the woman whose name remained forever linked to his. The final years of Loni Anderson. In her final years, Loni Anderson lived far from the noise that once followed her name. She made her home in Los Angeles with her fourth husband, Bob Flick, and centered her life on family. Time with her daughter, Deidre Hoffman, and her son, Quentin Reynolds, mattered more than publicity or career momentum. The spotlight that once defined her daily life became something she visited only occasionally and always on her own terms. Unlike her earlier decades in Hollywood, Anderson kept a deliberately low profile. She appeared from time to time at charity events and nostalgia conventions. These appearances were warm and measured, focused on fans who had followed her work for years, rather than media attention. However, behind that calm exterior, Anderson was dealing with a serious illness she chose not to make public. Insider reports later described the condition as both acute and prolonged, a private battle she endured away from cameras and headlines. True to her nature, she protected her family from unnecessary scrutiny and allowed speculation to fade rather than fuel it. Only after her passing did the full reality become known. Anderson died from metastatic uterine leiomyosarcoma, a rare and aggressive cancer that originates in the uterus and spreads to other organs. The diagnosis explained the length and severity of her illness and why her later years were marked by increasing privacy. It was a difficult fight, carried quietly and with dignity. Loni Anderson died on August 3, 2025, at a Los Angeles hospital. She was 79 years old, just days shy of her 80th birthday. The news was confirmed by her representative Cheryl J. Kagan, who noted that the illness had been ongoing. Colleagues and fans remembered her most vividly as Jennifer Marlowe, the role that made her a television icon and earned her 2 Emmy nominations. But tributes also emphasized something deeper: her resilience. After one of Hollywood's most public and damaging divorces, Anderson rebuilt her life without bitterness, choosing stability over spectacle and purpose over attention. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.